Okay, we are going to cover a little bit into Becker's first part of his ideal democracy lecture and writing. To begin, in the first section, which is pages 147 up through the top of 150, what Becker is doing here essentially is stating that first of all we need to define democracy. Okay, we need to be able to say what democracy is, what it isn't, and paint a little picture of how some of the more um, uh, thinkers in this country have thought of democracy over the course of its existence up until 1940. And we'll discuss one person who was an influential um, businessman in this country in a few minutes. Okay, so democracy, what is it? Well, Becker points out first that it's not something that we can just easily give an answer to. Does democracy mean, as we pointed out last week when we were looking at Madison and de Tocqueville, simply that um, it's a government by many, by the people and for the people? Does that make it a democracy? Yes, but in Becker's terms, we can't absolutely define it as such. Interesting point here is that he points out if democracy, a part of it is we elect individuals in a free democratic society. We elect who our leaders are going to be in this country. Uh, the problem with that is, and Becker gives a couple of examples here. He gives one of them as Napoleon, and the other as Caesar, who were both elected or put into their positions of power, leaders, by the people. They were put into power by the people, but there are not many that would think of France during the time of Napoleon as a democratic country. Okay? Napoleon was not looked at as a democratic leader. However, as Becker points out, he was put into power, into office by the people. Okay? The same with Caesar. The same holds true with Caesar as well. So, what is the difference? Well, as Becker points out here, democracy does not stop at simply electing a leader into office, okay, but actually having a say in that leader's decisions after the leader is in office. You see that point? That's a key point, and Becker wants to point that out. It's a very key point that, again, democracy does not stop at electing an official to lead or to govern, but also having a follow through with that leadership as well. Okay, and clearly in the case of Caesar and Napoleon, that wasn't the case. And those leaders got into power. They did not listen to the people telling them what they should be doing. They turned it into more of a dictatorship. So they were elected into office, but once they were elected into office, then they became dictators. There's a key difference there. Okay, so the democratic process cannot stop or be thought of solely on the process of electing leaders. We need to think about it as we have ownership in what that leader's decisions are throughout his or her term in office. Okay, very, very key point. Okay, so now let's talk for a minute about this question I asked you to think about last week. Is this ideal democracy or a republic? Okay, so we'll think about that for a few minutes now, and kind of talk about it for a couple minutes. Ideal democracy. Okay, a democracy, ideal democracy is based on people making decisions about what is going on in their lives, about laws, about rules, about policies. It's the people actually making the decisions. So for every decision, every law, the people would make it. They would vote on it. They would be responsible, the citizens, us, for making decisions in a true democracy. Republic, on the other hand, differs in this. The people, the citizens, pick representatives, other citizens, to vote on these topics or issues for them. Okay, does that sound familiar? Okay, so in other words, you know, we pick people that we believe will best represent us and our desires and our wants and our needs, and we ask them to vote on these issues in our place. Okay, now again, does that sound very familiar? That really is how our government works right now. Okay. How do we do that? Well, that's to come in a later conversation. We'll get more into talking about the republic and such when we look at government here over the next couple weeks. For now, I wanted to make that clear distinction that we are not a true democracy. We are a republic. Okay. Okay. One of the key things to point out here is, and this is on page 149 in your textbook, and I'll just briefly mention it here, that Andrew Carnegie, and we actually are going to do a reading from Carnegie later on when we look at wealth and poverty, the study of wealth and poverty, and there's a nice piece from Carnegie in our textbook. But for now, I think it's important to note that Andrew Carnegie, who was, of course, a very successful businessman that many Pennsylvanians know about because he lived in Pennsylvania and he did a lot of business in Pennsylvania, and his legacy lives in Pennsylvania still in the western part of our state. But Carnegie mentioned that and really believed, and this is when in 1886, in a book that Carnegie published, he stated that democracy was the premier style of government, and that just by the very nature, kind of like a natural selection process, if you will, by very nature of our existence as human beings, we have found the pinnacle, you know, the heaven on earth, government structure that will get us more to that utopian society. And Carnegie believed that was democracy. That was in 1886 in his publication. Well, Becker again is writing in 1940 um, that this was very much off the mark. Carnegie believed that again there would be no other forms of government that could threaten the existence of democracy, but Becker is living it that there is, and he's also uh, living the fact that democracy is at a really disadvantage right now over some other forms of government, mainly in the form of the totalitarian state and what was being swept across Europe by the German Nazis and their regime. Becker also points out in the next section here, which is on the next few pages, beginning on page 150 and going up through 153 or 54, that democracy, he kind of paints a historical picture of democracy here in telling us that democracy never really was found, was firmly rooted in this world. There were some attempts in the old Greece societies at democracy, which were successful. However, they were successful because of the fact that the Greek society at the time had small, what they called city-states, and those city-states were governed individually. Again, small groups of people with the same interests. They lived in the same locale, um, so they were more easily managed and governed. And that democracy worked really well in those small city-states. Now, he says that there have been other attempts throughout history to establish democracy, in places like Japan and Italy, but which ultimately failed. Okay, so his point here is that, hey, you know what? If we want democracy to survive and to thrive, we've got to really step back and think about this. It's not something that was deeply rooted in our world ever in history, but he believed that it could be, and he believed that if we made some changes, and we'll talk about those in the next video, that we could have a democracy that actually works. Okay, so that's where he's coming from on the next few pages. Um, and I'll stop it for here and end this video, and I'll put another one up in a few minutes. See you soon.